I never thought I'd find myself back here. This house, which once held so many memories, now felt distant and cold. But here we were, my wife Alice and I, standing on its familiar yet foreign doorstep. Life had thrown us a curveball, and after losing my job and facing mounting bills, we had no choice but to move in with my father. It was a decision I never wanted to make, but desperation can make you swallow your pride. My father greeted us with his usual stoic demeanor. He had never been the warmest person, even when things were good. After my mother left years ago, he had retreated further into his work, burying himself in long hours at the office. His new wife, Anna, stood beside him as we arrived. She was poised, her expression calm, yet there was something enigmatic in her gaze. The last time I saw her was at their wedding 2 years ago, and I was struck by how little she had changed. She had this timeless beauty, older, yes, but still graceful in a way that captivated me unexpectedly. "Make yourselves comfortable," my father said curtly, his tone more obligatory than welcoming. It was clear he wasn't thrilled with our presence, but at least he didn't turn us away. Anna stood silently behind him, observing us with a gentle smile. Her eyes, a deep shade of gray, seemed to see more than they let on. There was a warmth in her that contrasted sharply with my father's coldness. Though she was well into her 50s, she possessed a charm that defied age, and I couldn't help but notice the quiet strength she carried herself with. The first few days were awkward, to say the least. Alice and I tried to stay out of their way. I spent most of my time sending out resumes, doing online interviews, and hoping for a miracle that would get us back on our feet. Alice, meanwhile, kept herself busy with whatever she could find to distract her from our current predicament. My father was hardly ever home. He left early in the morning and returned late at night, leaving the house eerily quiet. And so it was just Anna and me, alone in this vast, silent house. At first, I tried to keep my distance, unsure of how to navigate this new dynamic. But it was impossible to avoid her entirely. She would often be in the garden, tending to her flowers, or in the kitchen preparing elaborate meals. There was something calming about her presence, something that drew me in, even if I wasn't ready to admit it. One evening, when my father was working late and Alice had gone to visit her sister for a few days, I found myself in the kitchen with Anna. She was preparing dinner, moving with a graceful efficiency that was almost hypnotic to watch. "Are you regretting moving back?" she asked softly, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. There was a sincerity in her voice that made it clear she wasn't just making small talk. "It's not exactly what I imagined for us," I finally admitted, my voice low. "But we didn't have much of a choice." Anna paused, wiping her hands on a towel before turning to face me. There was something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite decipher, that made my heart beat a little faster. Her smile was kind, yet there was a sadness there too, as if she understood more than she let on. Over the next few days, small, almost imperceptible changes began to occur between us. We would find ourselves lingering in the same rooms, exchanging glances that lasted a second too long. The house, with its echoing hallways and endless silences, became the backdrop for these quiet moments of connection. I was confused, torn between the sense of duty I felt toward my father and the growing pull I felt toward Anna. One warm afternoon, while Alice was still away, I found Anna in the garden, watering her beloved roses. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on her as she worked. I couldn't help but stop and watch her for a moment. She noticed me and smiled, wiping a stray strand of hair from her face. "Care to help?" she asked, handing me a watering can. "Sure," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I was unprepared for the rush of emotions that came from being close to her. As we worked side by side, the scent of earth and flowers filled the air, mingled with something uniquely hers, a faint, delicate perfume that lingered long after she had passed by. As we finished up, she placed a hand on my shoulder to thank me. The touch was light, almost casual, but it sent a jolt through me. For a moment, our eyes met, and the air between us seemed to hum with unspoken words. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but all I managed was a weak smile. She withdrew her hand slowly, her fingers lingering on my shoulder just a second too long before she turned away. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with her in my mind. There was a part of me that knew this was wrong, that I had no business feeling this way about her. Yet I couldn't stop. She had become a puzzle, and I was desperate to understand her, even if it meant losing myself in the process. The following evening, after my father had once again left for work, I found Anna sitting on the porch, a glass of wine in her hand. The moonlight cast a soft glow on her, making her look almost ethereal. I hesitated, but she waved me over, offering me a glass. We sat together in silence, the night air cool against our skin. I could feel her warmth beside me, and the quiet intimacy of the moment was almost too much to bear. As our hands brushed against each other on the porch railing, I felt a thrill of something that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Do you miss your life in the city?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper in the darkness. "Yes," I replied, though the word felt hollow. "But there are things I'm starting to appreciate about being here." She turned to look at me, her eyes searching mine as if trying to understand something hidden. And before I knew it, I had leaned in closer, the space between us closing until I could feel the warmth of her breath on my lips. But just as our lips were about to meet, we heard the sound of my father's car pulling into the driveway. We pulled away abruptly, hearts racing, as if caught in a crime. I knew then that we had crossed an invisible line. And though nothing had truly happened, it felt like everything had changed. The feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface were now boiling over, and I knew there was no going back. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted after that night on the porch. The moment when our lips had almost touched hung in the air like a secret, an unspoken confession between Anna and me. We both tried to pretend nothing had happened, but I knew. I could see it in her eyes every time our paths crossed in the house. The air between us was charged, heavy with words left unsaid, touches that never happened but lingered in the mind. The next few days were filled with a tense silence. My father seemed blissfully unaware of the change, too caught up in his work. Alice had returned from her trip, and though she was busy catching up with her sister, she noticed something was off with me. I tried to act normal, to laugh and chat with her as if my thoughts weren't constantly drifting back to Anna, but I wasn't fooling anyone. One morning, Alice went out for a long walk with a friend she hadn't seen in years, and my father, as usual, was already gone to the office. I was alone in the house with Anna. The tension between us had become unbearable, an invisible thread pulling us closer even as we tried to resist it. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, trying to drown my thoughts in the mundane routine, when Anna appeared in the doorway. She wore a light summer dress, the kind that made her look both elegant and effortlessly beautiful. She moved with a quiet grace, her hair slightly tousled, her face free of makeup. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice carrying that melodic warmth that always sent a shiver down my spine. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my heart was already racing. She walked over to the counter, too close for comfort, reaching past me to get a cup. I could feel the warmth of her body next to mine, the faint scent of jasmine and something uniquely hers. It was intoxicating. My hands trembled slightly as I poured the coffee. "You seem distracted lately," she remarked, her eyes studying me intently as she took a sip. "Is everything all right?" I looked at her, trying to read what was behind those steady eyes. There was a softness there, but also a knowing look, as if she could see right through my attempt to pretend nothing had changed. "I'm fine, Elid," forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." She nodded, but there was an understanding in her gaze that made me feel exposed, like she knew exactly what was tormenting me. For a long moment, we just stood there. The only sound in the kitchen, the ticking of the old wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm going to water the garden. Would you mind helping me?" I hesitated, knowing full well that being alone with her was a dangerous game. But there was something in the way she asked, something almost pleading, that I couldn't refuse. I nodded, following her out into the garden. The sun was warm, casting a soft glow over the rows of blooming flowers. The air was fragrant with the scent of earth and roses, a heady mix that made me feel lightheaded. Anna handed me a watering can, and we worked side by side in silence for a while, the tension between us building with every moment that passed. At one point, she leaned down to adjust a rosebush, and her hand brushed against mine. It was a light touch, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a jolt through me like an electric current. She looked up, her eyes wide, and for a second, I thought she would pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she stayed there, her fingers lingering on mine. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, as if she didn't know what she was apologizing for. The touch or the feelings it stirred in both of us. "Don't be," I found myself saying, my voice barely more than a whisper. I could feel my resolve crumbling, the wall I had built around myself slowly giving way to the desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. We were so close now, our faces inches apart, and I could see the way her breath quickened, her lips parting just slightly. I wanted to kiss her, to close the distance between us and finally give in to the pull that had been drawing us together. But before I could act on that impulse, she abruptly pulled back, her eyes filled with a mix of longing and guilt. "This can't happen," she said, her voice strained. "It's not right." "I know," I replied, my heart heavy with the weight of unspoken words. "But it feels." She shook her head, turning away from me. "We can't, James. We can't let this go any further." And with that, she walked back toward the house, leaving me standing there, torn between what I knew was right and the desire that was quickly consuming me. The rest of the day was a blur. I tried to focus on my job applications, on helping Alice with dinner, on anything but the feel of Anna's touch lingering on my skin. But that night, as I lay in bed beside Alice, all I could think about was the way Anna's eyes had looked at me, the way her lips had almost, but not quite, touched mine. The next few days were awkward. Anna and I avoided each other as much as we could, though in a house that size, it was impossible to completely stay apart. Every time we passed each other in the hallway, there was a flicker of something between us, a spark that refused to die. I knew it was only a matter of time before the dam broke. And break it did one stormy afternoon. The sky had darkened, and rain lashed against the windows as I sat in the living room, trying to read. I heard the creak of the stairs and looked up to see Anna standing there, drenched from the rain, her hair clinging to her face. She had been out, probably trying to clear her head, but now she looked like a woman on the brink of collapse. "James," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. "We need to talk." I set the book down and stood up, my heart racing. "What is it?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. She walked toward me, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and something else, something that mirrored what I was feeling. She stopped just a foot away from me, her hands trembling as she reached up to touch my cheek. "I've tried to ignore it," she whispered. "I've tried to pretend it's not there, but I can't anymore." Before I could respond, she closed the distance between us, her lips pressing against mine in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. It was like a dam breaking, all the pent-up emotions spilling out in that single, stolen moment. The world outside the window disappeared, and all I could feel was her warmth, her breath mingling with mine. But just as quickly as it began, she pulled away, her eyes wide with regret. "I'm sorry," she said, backing away. "I shouldn't have." I reached for her, but she turned and fled up the stairs, leaving me alone with the echoes of that kiss and the realization that there was no turning back now. We had crossed a line, and the path ahead was one of no return. After that kiss, everything unraveled. The fragile balance we had tried to maintain shattered into 1,000 pieces, and no matter how much we pretended otherwise, we could never go back to how things were. I felt like a man walking a tightrope, the ground beneath me cracking, but I couldn't stop. I was drawn to her, to Anna, like a moth to a flame I knew would eventually consume us both. The days that followed were a mess of confusion and guilt. Anna and I avoided each other, and yet, there was an unspoken agreement that neither of us could resist this pull. I tried to focus on my life with Alice, who, thankfully, was busy with her own activities and friends. She hadn't yet noticed the turmoil brewing inside me. The nights I would lie awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, replaying that kiss over and over in my mind. But the house was not large enough to hide in forever. Each time I heard Anna's soft footsteps or the way her voice carried through the hallway, it sent a thrill through me, followed quickly by a wave of guilt. I was torn between the woman I had promised to cherish and the one I could not seem to stop thinking about. The guilt gnawed at me, but the desire was stronger, a beast that refused to be tamed. A week after that fateful kiss, the stormy afternoon when it had all begun, Alice left for a weekend conference. She kissed me goodbye, her eyes sparkling with excitement at the chance to catch up with old colleagues. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the knot tightening in my stomach. The moment she drove away, the house felt emptier, the air heavier with the anticipation of what I feared might happen. My father, as usual, was busy at the office, leaving the house to Anna and me. The unspoken tension between us had only grown, the glances lingering a bit too long, the conversations cut short by a sudden, uncomfortable silence. I tried to distract myself by working in the garden, pruning roses under the bright sun, hoping the physical effort would exhaust these restless thoughts. But it was no use. The moment I saw Anna walk out onto the patio, her dress swaying gently in the breeze, I knew I was a lost cause. She hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to approach me, but then she made her way toward where I stood. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same struggle that mirrored my own. The world seemed to slow down as she came closer, her presence filling the space around us with that same, unbearable tension. "James," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, "we need to talk." I knew where this conversation would lead, but I couldn't bring myself to stop it. I put down the shears and wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to buy myself a moment to think, to gather whatever willpower I had left. But as soon as our eyes met, I knew it was futile. I was already falling, and there was nothing to hold on to. "What is it, Anna?" I asked, though my voice came out more like a plea than a question. She looked down, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her dress. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Whatever. This is between us, it needs to stop. We're going to hurt too many people." I wanted to agree, to tell her that she was right, that we were playing with fire. But I couldn't lie to her. Not now, not after everything. Instead, I reached for her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against mine. She didn't pull away, but her breath caught in her throat, and I saw tears welling in her eyes. "Anna," I began, struggling to find the right words. "I know this is wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you." Her eyes closed, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She shook her head, as if trying to shake away the feelings we both knew were too strong to deny. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't want to be the reason you destroy your life." Before I could respond, she stepped closer, closing the gap between us. The scent of her, that faint trace of jasmine, was intoxicating, and before I could stop myself, I pulled her into my arms. For a moment, she resisted, her hands pushing lightly against my chest. But then, as if surrendering to the inevitable, she melted into me, her arms wrapping around my neck. This kiss was different, deeper, more desperate, as if we were trying to steal back the time we had lost, the moments we had denied ourselves. Her fingers tangled in my hair, and I felt like I was drowning in her, in everything we weren't supposed to be. The world outside faded, and all that remained was the feel of her lips against mine, the taste of her breath. But then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. She pulled away, her eyes wide with panic. "No," she said, shaking her head frantically. "We can't do this. We have to stop." I reached for her again, but she backed away, her hands covering her face. "This is wrong, James. So wrong. I can't betray him like this. I care about you, but I can't." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The reality of what we were doing, the consequences of our actions, came crashing down around us. I watched her turn and run back into the house, her sobs echoing in the stillness of the afternoon. I stood there, alone in the garden, the taste of her kiss still lingering on my lips, a bitter reminder of the line we had crossed. The rest of the weekend was a blur. Anna locked herself away in her room, and I tried to pretend everything was normal. But every time I passed her closed door, I was tempted to knock, to beg her to talk to me, to tell me that we could find a way to make this work. But I knew it was useless. We had gone too far, and now there was no going back. On Sunday evening, just as the sun was setting, I found her in the living room, staring out the window at the fading light. Her eyes were red, and I could tell she hadn't slept. She turned to look at me, her expression a mix of sorrow and resignation. "We can't do this, James," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "For both our sakes, we have to end this now." I wanted to fight her, to tell her that what we felt was real, that we couldn't just ignore it. But deep down, I knew she was right. The weight of our actions was too heavy, the cost too high. So, with a heavy heart, I nodded. "I understand," I said, my voice cracking. "But that doesn't mean it's easy." She gave me a sad smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Goodbye, James," she whispered, before turning and walking away. The finality of it hit me like a blow, and I was left standing in the fading light, wondering how we had come to this point, and whether I would ever truly recover from it. The house felt emptier than ever after that. Alice returned, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed through our lives. And though I tried to be the husband she deserved, I couldn't shake the ghost of Anna from my mind. I thought it was over. I thought I could move on. But little did I know our story was far from finished. I thought I could bury it all, that if I tried hard enough, I could pretend nothing had happened between us. I threw myself into work, into being a better husband to Alice, trying to forget that kiss, those lingering touches, the way Anna's voice still echoed in my thoughts like a haunting melody. But the truth was, no matter how much I tried to rebuild my life, I could not erase what had already been written into my soul. Days turned into weeks, and I told myself that time would heal the wounds I had inflicted on myself, on all of us. But Anna's presence in the house was a constant reminder of what we had done, and what we could never undo. Every time I saw her, the memories came flooding back. The way her lips had tasted like forbidden fruit, the way her eyes had begged for me to stop even as her body leaned into mine. We were both trying to forget, yet neither of us could move on. My father, oblivious to the storm that had raged between his son and his wife, was busier than ever. He was often away on business trips, leaving Anna and me to coexist in a house that had grown colder, quieter. Alice, blissfully unaware, would smile and chat with Anna during their shared breakfasts, completely missing the tension that hung between us like a storm cloud ready to burst. I thought we could keep it hidden, that if we were careful enough, we could live our separate lives without the past coming back to haunt us. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially those that are buried so deeply in the heart. And then, everything came crashing down on a night I will never forget. It was a Friday evening. Alice had gone to visit her parents for the weekend, and my father was once again stuck in meetings out of town. I had tried to distract myself with some work, but as the hours dragged on, the emptiness of the house gnawed at me. I knew Anna was somewhere inside, probably hiding in her room like she often did, avoiding me as much as I avoided her. But that night, something pulled me toward her, like an invisible thread tightening around my heart. I found her in the living room, sitting alone with a glass of red wine. The lights were dim, casting a soft glow on her face, making her look almost ethereal, like a beautiful ghost. She looked up as I entered, her eyes tired and full of an emotion I couldn't quite name. For a moment we simply stared at each other, the air thick with all the things we hadn't said. "Do you ever think about what happened?" I asked, my voice barely louder than a whisper. I had no plan, no intention, just a desperation to break the silence that had grown between us like a wall. She looked down at her glass, swirling the wine slowly before taking a sip. "All the time," she admitted. But thinking about it doesn't change anything, James. Her words cut deep, and I felt my heart tighten. I took a step closer, my pulse quickening. Anna,
I'm sorry.
I've tried to forget, but I can't. I can't stop thinking about you. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You have to, she said, her voice breaking, because if we don't stop this, it will destroy everything. But even as she said those words, I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same battle I was fighting. Without thinking, I closed the distance between us. Her breath caught in her throat as I reached out to touch her cheek, my fingers trembling. For a moment, I thought she would push me away, but instead, she closed her eyes and leaned into my touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips. We were lost, both of us, adrift in a sea of emotions too strong to contain. I pulled her into my arms, and this time, there was no hesitation. Our lips met in a kiss that was both desperate and tender, filled with all the longing we had kept locked away. It was like coming up for air after drowning, a moment of relief that was too brief, too fleeting. But then, a sound shattered the fragile world we had created. The front door creaked open, and we both froze, our lips still inches apart, the taste of each other's breath still fresh. My heart plummeted as I heard the unmistakable sound of my father's voice calling out. Anna? James? Are you here? Panic surged through me, and Anna quickly pulled away, her eyes wide with terror. You have to go, she whispered frantically, pushing me toward the hallway. He can't find us like this. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. But before I could escape, my father entered the room. His eyes took in the scene. Anna flushed, her hair slightly tousled, and me, standing too close to her, my shirt rumpled. He wasn't a fool. He could read the signs. For a moment, there was silence. A silence so heavy it felt like the entire house was holding its breath. Then, my father's face twisted with rage and betrayal. What the hell is going on here? He demanded, his voice shaking. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. What could I possibly say that would make this right? I watched as his eyes darted between Anna and me, the realization dawning on him like a dark cloud blotting out the sun. Anna tried to step forward to explain, but he held up a hand, stopping her. Don't, he growled, his voice raw with hurt. Don't say another word. Both of you out. Now. I could see the devastation in his eyes, and it hit me like a knife to the chest. I had done this. I had destroyed the one thing that had held his life together. But there was nothing I could do to undo it. Without another word, I turned and left, the sound of my father's voice ringing in my ears, a harsh, final condemnation. The drive back to the city that night was a blur. Alice would be returning soon, and I had no idea what I would tell her. By the time I reached our apartment, I felt like a shell of myself, hollowed out by the weight of my actions. When Alice came home the next morning, she took one look at my face and knew something was terribly wrong. It all came pouring out in a torrent of guilt and shame. I watched her face crumple, the light in her eyes fading as she realized the depth of my betrayal. I begged for forgiveness, but she shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. You've destroyed us, James, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. She left that night, taking with her the last shreds of the life we had built together. I was alone, a man who had lost everything to a moment of weakness. As for Anna, I never saw her again. My father cut all ties with me, and the last I heard, Anna had left him as well. The house, once filled with memories, was now just another empty shell, a testament to everything we had ruined. In the end, I was left with nothing but the echoes of what might have been, haunted by the choices I could never take back. The taste of Anna's lips, the softness of her touch, were now just memories, fading like smoke in the cold morning light. And as I stood alone in the darkness, I realized that some fires, once kindled, burn everything to ash.